I never thought the empire I built from nothing would become the weapon my own daughter used against me. My name is Margaret Wilson, and at 62, I've spent the last 20 years turning a small logistics startup into a multi-million-dollar company. What I didn't realize was that while I was building a legacy for my family was building a plan to take it all away. Every morning at 5:30, I'd wake up in my downtown penthouse, make my coffee, and review the overnight reports from our West Coast operations. Wilson Logistics wasn't just a business to me. It was proof that a divorced woman with a high school diploma could create something that mattered. When my ex-husband left me and 2-year-old Jessica for his secretary 20 years ago, he laughed and said I'd never amount to anything without him. Last year, my company's revenue hit $47 million. I guess I showed him. The irony is that everything I built was for Jessica. Every late night, every missed dinner, every weekend spent in the office instead of at her soccer games, it was all so she'd never have to worry about money the way I did. I wanted her to have choices, opportunities, security. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was giving her the world. Jessica had always been my pride and joy. At 32, she was everything I'd hoped she'd become. Smart, successful, beautiful. She'd graduated from Northwestern with a marketing degree and landed a great job at a prestigious firm in Chicago. We talked every day, sometimes twice a day. She was my best friend, my confidant, the person who knew all my fears and dreams. When she called me Mom, it was the sweetest sound in the world. Our relationship had always been close, maybe because it was just the two of us for so long. After the divorce, I'd made a promise to myself that Jessica would never feel like she was missing anything. If she wanted dance lessons, she got the best instructor in the city. If she needed a car for college, she got a brand new Honda. When she graduated and wanted to move to a nice apartment, I co-signed the lease and helped with the deposit. I wasn't just her mother. I was her safety net, her biggest supporter, her cheerleader. But looking back now, I wonder if I was too good at that role. Maybe I made it too easy for her to see me as a resource rather than a person. 2 years ago, Jessica met David Miller at a marketing conference. He was handsome, charming, and worked for a tech startup that was doing well. When she brought him home for the first time, I was thrilled. Jessica had dated before, but never anyone serious enough to bring to family dinner. David was polite, asked intelligent questions about my business, and seemed genuinely interested in Jessica's career goals. Most importantly, he made my daughter happy in a way I hadn't seen before. Their relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, they were living together. Within a year, David proposed with a beautiful 2-carat diamond ring that Jessica proudly showed me over FaceTime. I cried happy tears that night, alone in my apartment, grateful that my baby girl had found someone who loved her the way she deserved to be loved. The wedding was small but elegant. I paid for everything, of course. The venue, the catering, Jessica's dress, the flowers. It cost me nearly $60,000, but seeing Jessica's face as she walked down the aisle made every penny worth it. David's mother, Linda Miller, seemed like a sweet woman. She was a 60-year-old widow who'd lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier. At the reception, she tearfully thanked me for raising such a wonderful daughter and said she was grateful to have Jessica as a daughter-in-law. Linda lived alone in a modest house about 30 minutes from Jessica and David's apartment. She seemed lonely, which tugged at my heartstrings. I'd been alone for so long after my divorce that I understood the ache of an empty house. When Jessica mentioned that she and David were planning to include Linda in their holiday celebrations and family dinners, I was proud of them for their kindness. But somewhere in those early months of their marriage, something shifted. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I told myself I was imagining things. Jessica's daily phone calls became every other day calls, then twice a week calls. When I'd ask about her day, she'd mention things she'd done with Linda, shopping trips, lunch dates, spa appointments. David's mom is so sweet, she'd say. She's been so lonely since his dad died. We're trying to keep her company. I thought it was wonderful. I really did. Having grown up without grandparents myself, I loved the idea of Jessica having that kind of relationship with her mother-in-law. But gradually, I started to notice that our conversations felt different. Jessica seemed distracted, less interested in the details of my work or my life. When I'd share exciting news about a new contract or a business milestone, her responses felt perfunctory. "That's great, Mom. Listen, I have to go. David's mom is coming over for dinner." The first real red flag came about 6 months after the wedding. I'd invited Jessica and David over for Sunday dinner, something that had been our tradition since she moved to the city. Jessica called that morning to cancel. "I'm so sorry, Mom, but Linda fell and hurt her ankle. We need to take her to urgent care and then stay with her for the day." Of course I understood. Family emergencies happen. But when I saw Jessica's Instagram story later that evening, it showed her, David, and Linda at a nice restaurant, all smiling and laughing. Linda's ankle seemed fine. When I mentioned it to Jessica the next day, she got defensive. "We went to dinner after urgent care, Mom. Linda was feeling better and wanted to get out of the house. I don't understand why that's a problem." Maybe it wasn't a problem. Maybe I was being oversensitive. But it hurt. It hurt that Jessica had lied to me, even about something small. It hurt that she'd chosen to spend our traditional Sunday together with Linda instead. And it hurt that when I expressed my feelings, Jessica made me feel like I was being unreasonable. The pattern continued over the following months. Plans with me were frequently canceled or postponed for Linda-related activities. Jessica and David's social media was filled with photos of family dinners and outings that always included Linda, but never included me. When I'd mention feeling left out, Jessica would sigh and say, "Mom, you're being dramatic. We see you all the time." But we didn't see each other all the time. In fact, we were seeing each other less and less. The daily phone calls stopped entirely. Our mother-daughter shopping trips became monthly instead of weekly, and even those often got rescheduled. Jessica's responses to my texts became shorter and took longer to come. I started to feel like I was bothering her by reaching out. The worst part was the way Jessica started talking about Linda compared to how she talked to me. When she mentioned her mother-in-law, her voice would get soft and affectionate. "Linda is so wise," she'd say. "She gives the best advice about marriage." Or, "Linda is such an amazing cook. She's teaching me her secret recipes." Meanwhile, when we'd talk, Jessica seemed impatient, always looking at her phone or finding reasons to cut our conversations short. I tried to rationalize it. Jessica was newly married and probably trying to bond with her husband's family. That was normal, healthy even. David was an only child and Linda was alone. Of course, they'd want to include her in their lives. I told myself that this was just a phase, that once the newness of marriage wore off, things would go back to normal between Jessica and me. But deep down, I knew something had fundamentally changed. My daughter was pulling away from me, and I didn't understand why. All those years of sacrificing, of putting her needs first, of building a business to secure her future, had they meant nothing? Was I losing my only child to a woman who'd known her for less than 2 years? The conversations I overheard when I visited their apartment started to make more sense in this context. Jessica and David would be talking quietly in the kitchen while I sat in the living room, and their voices would stop abruptly when I approached. Phone calls would end suddenly when I entered the room. There were private jokes and references I didn't understand, plans being made that didn't include me. One evening, I arrived at their apartment for dinner and found Linda already there, wearing an apron and cooking in Jessica's kitchen, like she belonged there. "Oh, Margaret," Jessica said, seeming surprised to see me even though we'd planned this dinner a week earlier. "Linda offered to make her famous pot roast. Isn't that sweet?" I spent that entire evening feeling like a guest in my own daughter's life, while Linda played the role of beloved family matriarch. She told stories about David's childhood, shared family recipes, and gave marriage advice like she'd known Jessica forever. Jessica hung on her every word, laughing at her jokes and asking follow-up questions with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. When Linda mentioned how nice it was to have a daughter again after so many years of loneliness, Jessica actually teared up and squeezed her hand. "I'm so lucky to have you," Jessica said. "You're like the mother I never had." I was sitting right there. I was the mother she did have. I was the mother who'd worked 18-hour days to pay for her college education, who'd never missed a parent-teacher conference despite having board meetings, who'd held her hair back when she was sick and celebrated every one of her achievements like it was my own. But apparently, I wasn't the mother she wanted. That night, I drove home in silence, tears streaming down my face. I called Jessica the next morning to talk about what she'd said, but she dismissed it immediately. "Oh, God, Mom, you're taking that way too seriously. I was just being nice to Linda. She's been so sad since David's dad died." But I knew what I'd heard. And I knew what I'd seen in Jessica's eyes when she looked at Linda compared to how she looked at me. I was becoming an obligation while Linda was becoming a joy. The months leading up to Mother's Day were particularly difficult. Jessica seemed to pull further and further away, and every attempt I made to bridge the distance between us only seemed to push her further toward Linda. When I'd suggest mother-daughter activities, Jessica was always busy with work or had plans with David's family. When I'd try to give her advice about marriage or career decisions, she'd mention that Linda had already weighed in, and her perspective was really helpful. I started to feel like I was competing with Linda for my own daughter's affection and losing badly. Every gift I gave Jessica was compared to something Linda had done. Every piece of advice I offered was measured against Linda's wisdom. Every attempt to maintain our close relationship was met with subtle resistance and growing distance. By April, I was desperate to fix whatever had gone wrong between us. I couldn't understand how the daughter who used to call me her best friend had become someone who seemed to barely tolerate my presence. I decided that Mother's Day would be my chance to reconnect with Jessica, to remind her of the bond we'd always shared and hopefully bridge the gap that had grown between us. I planned everything carefully. I made reservations at the Peninsula, our favorite upscale restaurant where we'd celebrated every one of Jessica's major milestones. I bought her a beautiful necklace from Tiffany, not because it was expensive, but because she'd mentioned admiring it months earlier when we'd walked past the store together. I even wrote her a heartfelt card expressing how proud I was of the woman she'd become and how much our relationship meant to me. I was determined to make this Mother's Day special, to remind Jessica that no matter how wonderful Linda was, I was her mother. I was the one who'd been there from day one, who'd sacrificed everything to give her the best life possible, who'd loved her unconditionally through every phase of her life. Surely that had to count for something. I had no idea that while I was planning to reconnect with my daughter, she was planning something that would shatter my heart and change our relationship forever. Mother's Day started like any other Sunday, except I woke up with a flutter of excitement in my chest. After weeks of feeling disconnected from Jessica, today was going to be our day. I'd specifically asked her to keep the afternoon free for just the two of us. No David, no Linda, just mother and daughter like old times. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing the blue dress Jessica had complimented me on last Christmas. I wrapped her gift carefully and wrote a note on the card about how grateful I was to be her mother. At 10:30, I drove to the restaurant to confirm our reservation and make sure everything was perfect for our 1 o'clock lunch. But at 11:15, my phone rang. "Hi, Mom," Jessica said, and I could hear something strained in her voice. "I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to push back our lunch. Linda had a really bad night. She's been crying about David's dad and feeling really depressed. David and I think we should take her to the spa to cheer her up, and then maybe we could meet you around 4. My heart sank, but I tried to be understanding. Depression was serious, and if Linda was struggling, of course Jessica and David should help her. "That's fine, sweetheart," I said. "Mental health is important. 4 o'clock works for me." 4 o'clock came and went. At 4:30, Jessica texted, "Running late. Linda wanted to get her nails done too, maybe 5:30? At 5:30, another text, "So sorry, Mom. Linda invited us to her house for dinner, and she's already started cooking. Can we do a quick visit instead of the restaurant? I know you'll understand." I didn't understand. It was Mother's Day, and I was the mother. I'd been planning this day for weeks, had made special reservations, had been looking forward to reconnecting with my daughter. But somehow Linda's spontaneous dinner invitation took precedence over our plans. By 6 o'clock, I was sitting in my apartment, still in my blue dress, staring at the wrapped gift on my coffee table. I felt foolish for getting my hopes up, for thinking that one day could fix whatever had gone wrong between Jessica and me. But I also felt something else, a growing anger that I'd been trying to suppress for months. At 7:15, Jessica finally showed up at my apartment. She looked beautiful but frazzled, her hair slightly messed from the wind and her makeup a little smudged. "Mom, I'm so sorry about today," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Linda was just having such a hard time and—" "It's fine," I interrupted, though it wasn't fine at all. "I understand that you had other obligations." Jessica seemed relieved that I wasn't making a scene. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small plastic flower, the kind you might find in a gas station display, and a card that looked like it had been written hastily in a car. "Happy Mother's Day," she said, giving me a quick hug that felt more like a formality than genuine affection. I opened the card. Inside, in Jessica's hurried handwriting, it said, "Thanks for everything, Mom. Love you." That was it. No personal message, no acknowledgement of our shared history, no indication that this day had any special meaning to her at all. But as I looked at my daughter standing in my living room, clearly eager to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On her left hand, catching the light from my chandelier, was an enormous diamond ring that definitely hadn't been there the last time I'd seen her. "Jessica," I said slowly, "that's a beautiful ring. I don't remember seeing it before." She glanced down at her hand and then back at me, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Oh, this? David bought it for his mom for Mother's Day, but she wanted me to try it on and see how it looked. It's just a loaner." Something about her explanation didn't sit right with me, but I was too hurt and tired to probe further. I thanked her for the plastic flower and the card, gave her another awkward hug, and watched her practically run out of my apartment, probably eager to get back to Linda's house for their family dinner. After she left, I sat alone in my living room, still wearing my blue dress, holding a $5 gas station flower and trying to process what had just happened. This was the daughter I'd sacrificed everything for. This was the child I'd built an empire to protect. This was the person I'd loved more than life itself. And she'd just given me the emotional equivalent of pocket change on the day that was supposed to celebrate our relationship. I tried to tell myself that Jessica was just going through a phase, that new marriages were complicated, that Linda probably did need extra support today. But deep in my gut, I knew something was terribly wrong. My daughter hadn't just forgotten about me on Mother's Day, she'd actively chosen someone else. That evening, unable to sleep and feeling more alone than I had in years, I did something I rarely did. I opened Facebook. I wasn't usually one for social media, but sometimes I liked to see photos of Jessica and David's adventures. Maybe seeing them happy would help me feel less sorry for myself. What I found instead shattered what was left of my heart. The first post was from Linda Miller, posted just 2 hours earlier. The photo showed her hand, wearing the massive diamond ring I'd seen on Jessica's finger, next to an elegant cruise brochure. The caption read, "My wonderful daughter-in-law Jessica surprised me with the most incredible Mother's Day gifts, a $20,000 diamond ring and a Mediterranean cruise. I'm so blessed to have such a generous, thoughtful daughter. Some people really know how to show love and appreciation. Mother's Day bliss, blessed mama, thoughtful family." I stared at the screen, reading the caption over and over again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The ring Jessica had claimed was just a loaner was actually a Mother's Day gift that Linda was now showing off to the world. And not just any gift, a $20,000 ring plus a cruise that probably cost another $10,000 minimum. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the comments. David's friends and Linda's neighbors were all gushing about how lucky Linda was to have such a generous daughter-in-law. Several people commented about how some people know the value of family and how this is what real love looks like. But what hit me hardest was Jessica's comment on the post. "You deserve the world, Linda. Thank you for being the most amazing mother-in-law and for welcoming me into your family with such open arms. I love you so much." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. While I was getting a plastic flower and a hastily written card, Linda was getting $30,000 worth of gifts and a public declaration of love from my daughter. While Jessica was canceling our Mother's Day plans, she was secretly orchestrating an elaborate surprise for her mother-in-law. The worst part was the math. Jessica didn't have $30,000 lying around for extravagant gifts. Her marketing job paid well, but not well enough for this kind of spending, which meant the money had come from somewhere else. And given that I'd been supplementing Jessica's income and helping with her expenses for years, I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly where that money had originated. I spent the rest of the night staring at that Facebook post, screenshotting it, reading it again and again until every word was burned into my memory. By morning, my sadness had transformed into something else entirely. A cold, hard determination to understand exactly what was happening in my daughter's life and why the woman I'd sacrificed everything for had just publicly humiliated me in favor of someone she'd known for 2 years. Something was very, very wrong in Jessica's marriage, and I was going to find out what it was. Because $30,000 in Mother's Day gifts didn't just appear out of thin air, and daughters who'd been raised with love and values didn't usually treat their mothers like afterthoughts while showering strangers with expensive presents. As I finally fell asleep that night, still wearing my blue dress, I made myself a promise. I was going to get to the bottom of this no matter what it cost me. Because after 20 years of building a business and a life around protecting my daughter's future, I deserved to know if she was using that future to buy someone else's love. The next few days passed in a blur of hurt feelings and growing suspicion. I couldn't stop thinking about that Facebook post, about the ring, about the way Jessica had lied to my face about it being a loaner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's smug caption about, "Some people really know how to show love and appreciation," a passive-aggressive dig that was clearly aimed at me. I tried calling Jessica on Monday to talk about Mother's Day, but she didn't answer. I tried again on Tuesday and she texted back saying she was swamped at work and would call me later. She never did. By Wednesday, my hurt was beginning to transform into something sharper, the kind of focused determination that had helped me build my business from nothing. I started with the most obvious question. Where had Jessica gotten $30,000 for Linda's gifts? I knew her salary, knew her expenses, knew that she and David were still paying off student loans and saving for a house. There was no way she had that kind of disposable income unless she'd gotten it from somewhere else. The answer came to me with a sick certainty. The trust fund I'd established for her when she turned 25. It was supposed to be for emergencies or major life purchases, a house down payment, starting a family, unexpected medical bills. I'd set it up so Jessica could access the funds when needed, but she was supposed to discuss major withdrawals with me first. It was a safety net, not a shopping spree fund. Thursday morning, I called my financial advisor and asked him to send me the recent activity reports for Jessica's trust fund. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, Jessica had made 3 significant withdrawals. $8,000 in January, $12,000 in March, and $15,000 just last week, right before Mother's Day. The timing of that last withdrawal wasn't a coincidence. She'd taken my money I'd earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice, and used it to buy extravagant gifts for another woman while giving me a gas station flower. But the financial betrayal was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into Jessica's recent behavior, patterns started emerging that painted a picture I didn't want to see. I spent Friday afternoon doing something I'd never done before, investigating my own daughter's social media presence like a detective. What I found was a curated narrative of Jessica's new life that had been carefully constructed to exclude me while positioning Linda as the central maternal figure. Going back through months of Instagram posts, I could see the evolution clearly. In the early days of Jessica's marriage, posts featured David, Jessica, and occasionally me. But gradually, I disappeared from the photos while Linda appeared more and more frequently. Recent posts showed Jessica and Linda cooking together, shopping together, getting manicures together, all the activities Jessica used to do with me. The captions told an even more disturbing story. While posts featuring me were tagged with generic messages like family dinner or good times, posts featuring Linda were filled with emotional language. So grateful for this woman's wisdom, the best mother-in-law a girl could ask for, learning so much from this amazing lady. But it was the comments section that really opened my eyes. Under photos of Jessica and Linda, David's extended family and friends consistently praised Jessica for being such a devoted daughter-in-law. Linda's sisters and neighbors commented about how lucky Linda was to have Jessica, how wonderful it was that Jessica treated Linda like her own mother, how rare it was to find a daughter-in-law who understood the importance of family. The message was clear. Jessica was being praised and rewarded for prioritizing Linda over me. In David's family circle, she was the hero of a heartwarming story about a young woman who rescued a lonely widow. I was nowhere in this narrative. Not as the mother who'd raised Jessica, not as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her success, not even as a person worthy of basic consideration. Saturday morning, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I was going to hire a private investigator. 20 years of running a business had taught me that when something doesn't make sense financially, there's usually more to the story. And nothing about Jessica's recent behavior made sense unless there was information I didn't have. The investigator I hired was a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in family and financial matters. I'd used her services once before to vet a potential business partner, and she'd been thorough, discreet, and accurate. When I explained what I wanted to know, she didn't seem surprised. Family financial deception is more common than you'd think, she told me, especially when there are significant assets involved. What Sarah uncovered over the next week made me realize that my daughter's betrayal was far worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just about the money, though the money was bad enough. It was about a systematic plan to manipulate me out of my own life while positioning Jessica as the perfect daughter-in-law in someone else's family. The investigation revealed that Jessica's relationship with Linda wasn't the spontaneous bonding I'd been led to believe. According to Sarah's research, Linda Miller was far from the sweet, lonely widow she pretended to be. She was a calculating woman who'd been married 3 times, had a history of financial disputes with previous in-laws, and had successfully alienated her late husband from his own children through similar manipulation tactics. More disturbing was the evidence that Jessica and David's marriage had been strategically planned from the beginning. David had specifically targeted successful women at networking events, and Jessica fit his pattern perfectly: ambitious, financially stable, with wealthy family connections, and no siblings to compete with for inheritance. The private investigator had documentation showing that Linda and David had researched my business and personal finances before David had even asked Jessica out. They knew about the trust fund, knew about my company's value, knew that Jessica was my only heir. What had seemed like a romantic courtship was actually a calculated targeting of my family's wealth. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of text messages Sarah had obtained through legal channels. The messages exchanged between Jessica, David, and Linda revealed the true nature of their relationship and their plans for my future. In one exchange from 3 months earlier, Jessica had written, "She's getting suspicious about the money. We need to be more careful about the withdrawals." David had responded, "Just keep playing the dutiful daughter for a little longer. Once we get her to transfer the business holdings, it won't matter what she thinks." Linda's reply had been the most chilling. "I've done this before. Trust me. Older women like her always cave eventually. They're so desperate to feel needed that they'll sign over everything just to keep their children from abandoning them completely." Whoa, reading those messages felt like being stabbed in the heart by the person I'd trusted most in the world. My daughter, the child I'd worked 18-hour days to support, the young woman I'd put through college, the person I'd built an entire empire to protect, was actively plotting against me with people who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited. But the worst was yet to come. The final piece of evidence Sarah presented was a folder of documents that David had filed with a local law firm. The papers outlined a strategy for having me declared mentally incompetent so that Jessica could assume power of attorney over my business and personal assets. They'd been building a case based on my erratic behavior and increasing isolation, supported by testimony from David's family about my concerning inability to accept Jessica's marriage and new family relationships. In other words, they were planning to steal my company and my freedom by painting me as a crazy, jealous old woman who couldn't handle her daughter's happiness. They were going to use my love for Jessica as evidence of my mental decline, and Jessica was going to let them do it. As I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by evidence of my daughter's betrayal, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the complete death of unconditional love. For 32 years, I'd loved Jessica with every fiber of my being. I'd forgiven her mistakes, supported her dreams, sacrificed my own needs for hers, and believed that our bond was unbreakable. Now I knew the truth. Jessica didn't just not love me, she actively despised me. She saw me as an obstacle to her financial goals, an embarrassment to her new social status, a burden to be managed until she could figure out how to eliminate me entirely. The plastic flower was still sitting on my kitchen counter, a $5 symbol of everything our relationship had become. But as I looked at it now, I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt angry. I felt betrayed. And I felt determined to make sure that Jessica learned a very important lesson about what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. My daughter thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She thought she could manipulate me the way Linda had apparently manipulated her previous in-laws. She thought that because I'd been a loving, generous mother, I was also a foolish, vulnerable target. She was about to learn how wrong she was, because the same intelligence and ruthlessness that had built Wilson Logistics from nothing was about to be turned on the family that had decided to make me their enemy. The game was on, and Jessica had no idea that she'd just picked a fight with someone who played to win. The documents Sarah presented to me that Monday morning were like pieces of a puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. But once I started putting them together, the complete picture of my daughter's betrayal became horrifyingly clear. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said, sliding another folder across my desk, "what I'm about to show you goes beyond simple financial manipulation. This is a systematic, long-term con that's been in motion since before Jessica even met David." The first document was a background check on Linda Miller that revealed she wasn't the grieving widow she pretended to be. Linda had been married 3 times, and each marriage had ended with significant financial gain for her. Her first husband, whom she'd divorced after 10 years, had been forced to pay substantial alimony after Linda successfully argued that she'd sacrificed her career for their marriage. Her second husband had died in a suspicious accident 2 years after changing his will to leave her everything, cutting out his adult children from his first marriage. David's father, her third husband, had also died under circumstances that raised questions. But more importantly, he'd changed his will just months before his death to leave Linda the house and a substantial life insurance payout. "The pattern is always the same," Sarah explained. "She targets successful men with assets, isolates them from their existing family members, then positions herself as the victim when relationships deteriorate. She's particularly skilled at turning children against their own parents." But it was the next set of documents that made my blood run cold. Sarah had uncovered communications between Linda and a network of other women who ran similar operations across the country. They shared strategies, target lists, and even legal advice on how to maximize their take from vulnerable families. Linda wasn't just a gold digger. She was part of an organized group that specialized in family destruction for profit. The most damning evidence was a series of emails Linda had sent to her sister in Phoenix, detailing her plans for Jessica and me. In one message from 6 months ago, she'd written, "The daughter is even easier to manipulate than I expected. She's desperate for maternal approval after growing up with a workaholic mother. I just have to play the warm, nurturing figure her mother never was, and she'll do anything to please me. The mother is wealthy but emotionally vulnerable. Classic target." Another email from 3 months ago was even more explicit. Phase 1 complete. The daughter now sees me as the ideal mother figure and is actively distancing herself from her biological mother. Phase 2 begins next month. We start the financial transfers under the guise of family emergencies and investment opportunities. Phase 3 will be the competency challenge. I've done this twice before, and it works every time. These successful women always think they're too smart to be manipulated, which makes them perfect marks. Reading Linda's clinical assessment of my relationship with Jessica felt like being dissected alive. Every insecurity I'd ever had about my parenting, every moment I'd wondered if I'd worked too much or missed too many school events, every fear that I hadn't been the mother Jessica needed, Linda had identified and weaponized them all. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Sarah handed me a transcript of a recorded phone conversation between Jessica and Linda from just 2 weeks ago. The recording had been obtained legally through David's phone records during Sarah's investigation, and listening to it destroyed any remaining hope I had that my daughter was a victim rather than a willing participant. "Mom thinks she's so smart," Jessica's voice said on the recording, and hearing her refer to me as Mom while talking to Linda felt like a knife in my chest. "She has no idea we've been planning this for months. She's so desperate to feel needed that she doesn't even notice how much money I've been taking." Linda's voice responded with cold calculation. "Just stick to the plan, honey. The competency hearing is scheduled for next month. David's lawyer says we have plenty of evidence of her erratic behavior and declining mental state. Once we get guardianship, you'll have full control of her assets and the business." "I almost feel bad sometimes," Jessica continued, though her tone suggested she didn't feel bad at all. "She worked so hard to build that company, and she really does love me, but she's been holding me back my whole life with her controlling behavior and her expectations. This is my chance to finally be free and have the life I deserve." "Don't feel guilty," Linda replied. "Women like your mother think they own their children's lives just because they provide financial support. What we're doing is justice. Besides, she'll be much happier in a nice care facility where she doesn't have to worry about business decisions anymore." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Jessica and Linda discussing which of my assets they'd liquidate first, how they'd explain my mental decline to my business partners, and where they'd place me once they had legal control. They talked about me like I was already dead, like I was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed from their path to wealth and comfort. As the recording ended, I sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just financial betrayal. This was a complete assassination of everything I'd built, everything I was, everything I meant to the daughter I'd loved more than life itself. Jessica didn't just want my money. She wanted me erased entirely so she could take my place as the successful businesswoman she'd never had the courage or work ethic to become on her own. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out one final folder that contained the most shocking revelation of all. "Mrs. Wilson," she said gently, "I need to show you something that changes everything we thought we knew about this situation." The documents in the folder revealed that David Miller wasn't Linda's biological son. He was her nephew, the son of Linda's deceased sister, whom Linda had adopted when he was 16 after his parents died in a car accident. But the adoption wasn't motivated by love or family loyalty. It was part of Linda's long-term financial strategy. According to the documentation Sarah had uncovered, Linda had been grooming David since his teenage years to be her partner in targeting wealthy families. She'd paid for his education, helped him develop his charm and social skills, and taught him how to identify and pursue women with significant family wealth. Jessica wasn't David's first mark. She was his third. David's previous relationships had followed the same pattern: charming courtship, quick engagement, gradual isolation of the target from her family, then systematic financial exploitation. His first victim had been a doctor's daughter in Denver, who'd lost her inheritance to legal fees fighting the competency case David and Linda had brought against her father. His second had been a tech executive's daughter in Seattle, who'd signed over her trust fund to invest in David's fake business ventures. Jessica was just the latest in a line of successful women whose love and trust had been weaponized against them and their families. But what made her case different was the scale of the target. My business was worth far more than David's previous victims' inheritances, and Jessica's willingness to actively participate in destroying me made their scheme more ambitious than anything they'd attempted before. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and absolutely heartbreaking. My daughter hadn't fallen in love with a man who gradually corrupted her. She'd been deliberately targeted, manipulated, and turned into a weapon against me by professionals who made their living destroying families. But as I absorbed the full scope of their betrayal, I felt something unexpected: relief. For months, I'd been torturing myself trying to understand how the loving daughter I'd raised could become someone who treated me with such cruelty. Now I knew it wasn't really Jessica making these decisions. It was Jessica under the influence of master manipulators who'd been perfecting their technique for years. That realization didn't excuse her choices, but it did clarify mine. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was fighting to save my daughter from people who would eventually discard her once they'd extracted everything valuable from our family. Linda and David weren't planning to share their spoils with Jessica forever. They were planning to use her until she was no longer useful, then move on to their next target. The question was, how could I expose their scheme and save both myself and Jessica before it was too late? The answer came to me with the same clarity that had guided every major business decision I'd ever made. I couldn't save Jessica by confronting her directly. Linda's psychological manipulation was too strong, and Jessica was too invested in her new identity as the perfect daughter-in-law. Instead, I had to outmaneuver Linda and David at their own game. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a strategy that would have made my business school professors proud. If Linda and David wanted to play chess with my family's future, I was going to show them what it meant to face a grandmaster. My first move was to protect my assets without alerting them to my knowledge of their plan. I quietly transferred the majority of my business holdings into an irrevocable trust that Jessica couldn't access even if she gained power of attorney over me. I moved my personal assets into accounts they didn't know existed and placed my company shares under the control of my most trusted business partner, with instructions that they could only be transferred back to me personally, not to any guardian or representative. Next, I began documenting everything. I installed security cameras in my home and office to record any future interactions with Jessica, David, or Linda. I started carrying a voice recorder to capture conversations. I had my doctor perform a comprehensive mental health evaluation to establish my competency on the record. I was building a fortress of evidence that would make their competency case impossible to win. But my masterstroke was something they'd never expect. I was going to beat them to the punch by calling my own family meeting and exposing their scheme before they could execute it. I spent days planning the perfect setup. It had to be somewhere they'd feel comfortable and confident, somewhere they wouldn't suspect a trap. I decided on Jessica's birthday party, which was scheduled for the following weekend. Jessica had invited me, probably as part of maintaining the facade that everything was normal between us. It would be the perfect opportunity to gather all the players in one room and reveal what I knew. The invitation had specified that it was a small family celebration at Jessica and David's apartment. Linda would be there, of course, along with some of David's extended family and a few of Jessica's friends. It was exactly the kind of intimate setting where Jessica felt most comfortable playing her role as the devoted daughter-in-law, while treating me like an afterthought. I RSVP'd enthusiastically, even offering to bring the cake and champagne. Jessica seemed surprised by my enthusiasm, but pleased that I was finally making an effort to be part of their family celebrations. She had no idea that I was planning to make this a birthday party none of them would ever forget. In the days leading up to the party, I made my final preparations. I had Sarah compile all of our evidence into a comprehensive presentation that laid out every detail of Linda and David's scheme. I consulted with my lawyer about the best way to present the information to maximize its legal impact. I even hired a private security firm to be on standby in case things got ugly when the truth came out. But the most important preparation was emotional. I had to accept that this confrontation would likely destroy any chance of reconciling with Jessica, at least in the short term. She was too deeply under Linda's influence to immediately recognize the truth, and her pride would make it difficult for her to admit she'd been manipulated. But I couldn't save her by enabling her delusions, and I couldn't protect my life's work by pretending everything was normal. The night before the party, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd called me crying when she failed her driving test the first time, the young woman who'd hugged me tight after her college graduation and whispered that she couldn't have done it without me, that Jessica was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of manipulation and false promises. Tomorrow, I was going to fight to bring her back. Saturday evening arrived with all the inevitability of a thunderstorm. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected authority and confidence. This wasn't a social occasion. It was a business meeting that would determine the future of my family and my company. I arrived at Jessica's apartment carrying an expensive birthday cake and a bottle of champagne, playing my part as the loving mother attending her daughter's celebration. Jessica greeted me with a hug that felt more genuine than any interaction we'd had in months, probably because she thought she was so close to achieving her goals. "Mom, you look great," she said, taking the cake from my hands. "I'm so glad you're here. Linda's been looking forward to seeing you again." Linda was indeed there, holding court in Jessica's living room like the queen of the family. She was wearing an expensive dress that I was certain had been purchased with money from Jessica's trust fund, and the $20,000 Mother's Day ring sparkled on her finger like a trophy of her victory over me. "Margaret!" Linda exclaimed when she saw me, standing up to give me a hug that felt like being embraced by a snake. "How wonderful to see you, dear. Jessica's told me so much about how proud you are of her new life." The gathering was small, but carefully curated. Besides Jessica, David, and Linda, there were David's 2 cousins, Linda's sister visiting from Phoenix, and 3 of Jessica's work friends. Everyone seemed relaxed and happy, completely unaware that they were about to witness a confrontation that would shatter the evening's festive atmosphere. For the first hour, I played my part perfectly. I complimented Linda on her dress, asked David about his work, and chatted pleasantly with Jessica's friends about her success at the marketing firm. I was the picture of a proud mother celebrating her daughter's birthday, giving no indication that I knew anything about the conspiracy unfolding around me. But as we gathered around the dining table for cake and champagne, I knew it was time to drop the mask. "Before we cut the cake," I announced, standing up and raising my champagne glass, "I'd like to make a toast and share some exciting news with everyone." Jessica beamed at me, probably thinking I was about to announce my retirement or some other development that would benefit her plans. David and Linda exchanged satisfied glances, clearly believing that everything was proceeding exactly as they'd hoped. "First," I continued, "I want to say how proud I am of Jessica and how much I've learned about family loyalty over the past few months. Watching my daughter's relationship with her new family has been truly educational. The room murmured with appreciation, and Linda actually dabbed at her eyes as if she were moved by my words. "Which brings me to my announcement," I said, my voice taking on a sharper edge. "I've decided to make some major changes in my business and personal life, changes that I think will surprise everyone here." I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick folder of documents. The mood in the room shifted slightly as people noticed the serious expression on my face and the official-looking papers in my hands. "You see," I continued, "I recently hired a private investigator to look into some financial irregularities I'd noticed, and what she discovered was absolutely fascinating." Jessica's face went pale, and I saw David's hand tighten on his champagne glass. Linda, to her credit, maintained her composure, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to figure out how much I knew. I learned that my daughter has been withdrawing significant amounts of money from her trust fund without discussing it with me, money that was used to purchase expensive gifts for people outside our immediate family. The room was dead silent now. Jessica's friends looked confused, but David's family members were beginning to understand that something was very wrong. I also learned, I continued, pulling out specific documents and placing them on the table where everyone could see them, that those gifts were part of a larger pattern of financial manipulation orchestrated by people who have made a career out of targeting and exploiting successful families. I turned to look directly at Linda, whose mask was finally beginning to slip. Linda Miller, whose real name is Linda Kowalski, has been married 3 times and has systematically defrauded each of her husband's families out of their inheritances. Her partner in these schemes is David Miller, who isn't actually her son but her nephew, whom she's been grooming since adolescence to target wealthy women. The explosion of voices was immediate. Jessica shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mom, what the hell are you doing? This is my birthday party." "Sit down, Jessica," I said firmly, using the same tone I'd used when she was a child caught lying about homework, "because you need to hear this." I pulled out the transcript of her recorded conversation with Linda and began reading her own words back to her. "Mom thinks she's so smart. She has no idea we've been planning this for months. She's so desperate to feel needed that she doesn't even notice how much money I've been taking." Jessica's face went white as she recognized her own voice. Around the table, her friends looked shocked and confused, while David's family members began whispering among themselves. "The plan," I continued relentlessly, "was to have me declared mentally incompetent so that Jessica could gain control of my business and assets. They'd already filed preliminary paperwork with a lawyer and were planning to move forward with the competency hearing next month." Linda finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous, Margaret. You're clearly having some kind of breakdown, which proves that you do need help managing your affairs." "Actually," I said, pulling out more documents, "I had a comprehensive psychological evaluation performed last week. Dr. Matthews from Northwestern Memorial found me to be in excellent mental health, with no signs of cognitive decline or impairment. The evaluation is part of my medical record now, which will make your competency case rather difficult to pursue." David tried a different approach. "Mrs. Wilson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we should discuss this privately." "No misunderstandings," I interrupted, pulling out photos and financial records. "Sarah Chen, my private investigator, has documented your entire operation, your previous victims in Denver and Seattle, Linda's history of insurance fraud and elder abuse, the network of other women you work with to share targeting strategies. We have it all." Now I turned back to Jessica, who was now crying with what looked like genuine shock and fear. "The saddest part, sweetheart, is that you were never going to be their partner in this. Once they'd gotten control of my assets, they would have moved on to their next target and left you with nothing. Linda's done this before. She discards her accomplices once they're no longer useful." "You're lying!" Jessica screamed, but her voice broke on the words. "Linda loves me. She's been more of a mother to me than you ever were." "Linda doesn't love anyone," I said gently. "She's a professional con artist who identified your insecurities and used them against you. Everything she's told you about me, every criticism of my parenting, every suggestion that I was holding you back, it was all designed to turn you against me so she could access my money through you." I placed the final set of documents on the table. Bank records showing how Linda had used similar tactics with David's previous girlfriends, emails detailing her strategies for breaking family bonds, and evidence of the fake business investments she'd used to steal from her previous victims. The room erupted into chaos. Jessica's friends were demanding explanations while trying to comfort her. David's cousins were backing away from the table, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the scandal. Linda's sister was staring at her in shock, apparently unaware of the extent of Linda's criminal activities. But it was David's reaction that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Instead of defending himself or protesting his innocence, he grabbed Linda's arm and whispered urgently in her ear. They were already planning their exit strategy, probably calculating how quickly they could disappear before law enforcement caught up with them. "The good news," I announced over the noise, "is that I've already taken steps to protect my assets and my business. Everything has been moved into irrevocable trusts that can't be accessed through guardianship or power of attorney. So even if you'd succeeded in having me declared incompetent, you wouldn't have gotten a penny." Jessica looked up at me through her tears, her face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and dawning realization. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. "You've destroyed my marriage, my relationship with David's family, my whole life." "No, sweetheart," I said sadly. "I've saved your life. These people were never going to let you keep any of what they stole. They were going to use you up and throw you away, just like they did to their previous victims." But Jessica wasn't ready to hear the truth. She was too invested in the fantasy Linda had created, too humiliated by the public exposure of her betrayal, too angry at me for shattering her delusions of easy wealth and perfect family relationships. "Get out," she said, her voice cold and final. "Get out of my house and don't ever come back. I never want to see you again." The words hit me like physical blows, but I'd expected them. Jessica needed time to process what she'd learned, to separate the truth from the lies she'd been fed, to grieve the loss of the people she'd thought loved her. I couldn't force her to forgive me or to immediately see Linda and David for what they really were. I gathered my documents and walked toward the door, but not before delivering one final message. "Jessica, when you're ready to hear the truth about what really happened here, when you're ready to understand how these people manipulated and used you, I'll be waiting. I love you, and that will never change, no matter what you've done or what you choose to do next." As I left the apartment, I could hear the arguments and accusations continuing behind me. Jessica was screaming at David, demanding explanations. Linda was trying to maintain control of the narrative, insisting that I was the real manipulator. David's family members were asking uncomfortable questions about things that suddenly made sense in a new and disturbing context. But I was done being part of their drama. I'd played my hand, revealed their scheme, and protected my assets. Now I had to wait and see if Jessica would eventually find her way back to the truth, or if Linda's psychological manipulation was too strong to overcome. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new beachfront condo in Santa Barbara, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean and reflecting on how completely my life had changed. The sale of Wilson Logistics had closed the week before, making me wealthier than I'd ever imagined, but also freeing me from the burden of running a company that had consumed 40 years of my life. The decision to sell hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. After the confrontation at Jessica's birthday party, staying in Chicago had become impossible. The business community was small, and word of the family scandal had spread quickly. More importantly, keeping the company would have meant constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for Linda and David's next move, or hoping that Jessica would eventually return to claim what she thought was rightfully hers. Instead, I'd chosen to liquidate everything and start fresh. The company had sold for more than I'd expected, and after taxes and fees, I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working again. More importantly, I had enough to pursue the dreams I'd deferred while building my business empire. The first dream I'd pursued was travel. In the 3 months since leaving Chicago, I'd been to Italy, Greece, and Portugal, staying in small coastal towns and eating in family-owned restaurants where nobody knew my story or cared about my business success. I'd remembered what it felt like to be Margaret the person, rather than Margaret the CEO, and I'd discovered that I actually liked who I was when I wasn't constantly fighting to prove my worth through professional achievement. But the biggest change in my life wasn't geographical or professional, it was emotional. For the first time in decades, I was choosing to invest my time and energy in relationships that were genuinely reciprocal. I joined a mentorship program for young female entrepreneurs, sharing my business experience with women who were hungry for knowledge and grateful for guidance. I'd volunteered with a literacy program that taught reading skills to adults who'd missed educational opportunities earlier in their lives. I'd even started dating again, meeting a retired professor named Robert who appreciated my intelligence and independence without trying to exploit them. These new relationships reminded me what healthy family dynamics were supposed to look like. The young entrepreneurs I mentored respected my boundaries while valuing my advice. The literacy students were grateful for my help without expecting me to solve all their problems. Robert enjoyed my company without trying to change me or manipulate me into serving his agenda. The contrast with my relationship with Jessica couldn't have been starker. For years, I'd convinced myself that Jessica's increasing demands and entitled behavior were normal expressions of family love. I'd interpreted her selfishness as confidence, her manipulation as closeness, her exploitation as need. Now I could see how unhealthy our dynamic had become, even before Linda and David entered the picture. Jessica had learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, and I'd enabled that perception by always saying yes to her requests and never requiring her to give anything back. I'd been so afraid of losing her love that I'd allowed her to take my love for granted, which ultimately made it easy for Linda to convince her that I was the problem in our relationship. The hardest lesson I'd learned was that unconditional love didn't mean accepting unconditional abuse. I could love Jessica forever without allowing her to treat me poorly, and I could wish her well without sacrificing my own well-being to fund her lifestyle choices. But despite my new perspective and my growing contentment with my independent life, I still missed my daughter terribly. Every sunset I watched alone, every beautiful sight I experienced without being able to share it with her, every holiday that passed without a phone call, they all reminded me of the family I'd lost and the granddaughter I might never meet. The worst part was not knowing how she was doing. After our confrontation, I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Jessica and David's marriage had fallen apart within weeks. Linda had disappeared entirely, probably to her next target family, leaving David without his operational partner and Jessica without her surrogate mother figure. David had moved out of their apartment and left town, apparently returning to whatever life he'd had before Linda recruited him into her schemes. Jessica had been forced to face the truth about the people she'd trusted and the choices she'd made. According to the reports I'd heard, she'd been devastated by the realization that her marriage had been fake, that Linda's love had been an act, and that she'd betrayed the one person who'd actually loved her unconditionally for people who'd never cared about her at all. But pride and shame were powerful forces, and Jessica hadn't reached out to me. I'd sent her a few text messages in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, letting her know that I loved her and would be there when she was ready to talk. But she'd never responded, and I'd eventually stopped trying. I couldn't force her to forgive me, and I couldn't undo the damage that had been done to our relationship. The closest I'd come to contact with her had been a month after the confrontation, when my phone rang 28 times in a single evening. I'd been in Italy at the time, and the international calling rates meant that whoever was trying to reach me was desperate enough to spend hundreds of dollars on phone charges. The voicemails had all been from Jessica, and listening to them had broken my heart all over again. Her voice had been panicked, tearful, and desperate as she begged me not to sell the company. "Please, Mom," she'd sobbed in message after message. "I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you, but please don't sell everything. Please don't take away my inheritance. I can change. I can be better. I can make this right." But it had been too late. The sale had already been finalized, the papers had already been signed, and the money had already been transferred. Even if I'd wanted to reverse the decision, it would have been impossible. More importantly, Jessica's messages had focused entirely on the financial implications of my choice rather than on our relationship or her own behavior. She'd been sorry about losing her inheritance, but she hadn't apologized for betraying me. She'd been panicked about her financial future, but she hadn't acknowledged the emotional damage she'd caused. She'd been desperate to undo the consequences of her actions, but she hadn't taken responsibility for the actions themselves. Those voicemails had confirmed that Jessica still wasn't ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened between us. She was still thinking like someone who'd been trained by Linda to see our relationship in transactional terms, where apologies were tactics to get what she wanted rather than genuine expressions of remorse. So I hadn't called her back. Instead, I'd sent her a final text message. "I love you, Jessica, and I always will. When you're ready to talk about us rather than about money, I'll be here. But I won't discuss my business decisions or your inheritance until you can acknowledge how your choices affected our relationship." She'd never responded to that message, and I hadn't heard from her since. Now, sitting in my peaceful condo with a glass of wine and a book about Italian history, I was learning to accept that Jessica might never be ready for the kind of honest conversation that could repair our relationship. Linda's psychological manipulation had been professional grade, and its effects might be permanent. Jessica might always see me as the mother who ruined her life, rather than the mother who saved her from people who were using her. But I'd also learned that I could build a meaningful life without Jessica's love or approval. The young women I mentored were creating the kind of close, supportive relationships I'd always wanted with my daughter. The volunteer work I did provided the sense of purpose I'd once gotten from business success. The new friendships I'd formed were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or manipulation. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than for someone else. I was making choices based on what brought me joy rather than what impressed other people. I was building relationships that enhanced my life rather than depleted it. Jessica had taught me an invaluable lesson, though probably not the one she'd intended. She'd shown me that family relationships, like all relationships, needed to be mutual to be healthy. Love alone wasn't enough if it wasn't balanced by respect, consideration, and reciprocity. My new life was smaller than my old life in some ways. No company to run, no employees to manage, no board meetings to attend. But it was also richer, more authentic, and more peaceful than anything I'd experienced in decades. 6 months after leaving Chicago, I was finally ready to admit that Jessica's betrayal had been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to examine my own patterns, to recognize my own enabling behaviors, and to build the kind of life I actually wanted, rather than the kind of life I thought I was supposed to want. And if Jessica ever decided she wanted to be part of that life, really part of it rather than just taking from it, I'd be ready to have that conversation. But I was no longer waiting for her to change or hoping for her approval. I was living my own life, on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms was still somewhere inside the woman who'd chosen Linda over me. But I couldn't save her from the storm she'd created. She had to find her own way to safety. All I could do was make sure that when she was ready to come home, there would still be a home waiting for her. Until then, I had sunsets to watch, books to read, and a whole new life to explore. And for the first time in years, that felt like more than enough.